It appears that Europe is laying the groundwork for disposing of Greece. For more than the past 2 years, the Europeans have reluctantly subsidized Greece. At first glance, it's difficult to see why. At 160% of GDP, Greece's debt situation is unrecoverable even before one takes into account that it has one of Europe's oldest populations, denying it indigenous growth opportunities and saddling it with massive pensions costs. Since achieving independence in the 1820s, Greece has only ever achieved meaningful growth when it has had an external sponsor willing to fund the Greeks. Since the end of the Cold War, the only sponsor Greece has been able to access is the cheap credit of association with the European Union in general and the Eurozone in specific. Greece hasn't succeeded on its own merits since antiquity. And keeping Greece alive isn't cheap. The bailouts to date total about 220 billion euro. In the future, if one assumes that the Greeks can balance their budget, and there has yet to be a reasonable plan for achieving that goal, simply servicing its current debt load would cost the Europeans about 30 billion euro annually. Yet the European largesse has continued, simply because Greek failure would have unwound the Eurozone. At the start of the crisis back in 2008, the Europeans collectively had direct exposure to Greek banks, corporations, and government debt to the tune of over 300 billion euro. The fear, the perfectly reasonable fear, was that a Greek default would instantly destroy the Greek banking sector, leading to a storm of cross-border financial collapses that would bring down the entire zone. But 2 years on, those exposures have been reduced drastically. The Greek government has had ever more troubles finding buyers for its debt outside of Greece, forcing it to turn to its own central bank and pension funds in ever larger volumes. The ECB has been willing to accept Greek debt as collateral in order to keep the system functioning. This has allowed most of those who hold the stuff to dispose of it. And European banks have, for all intents and purposes, ceased lending to the Greeks, government, banks, or corporations at all. As of the end of the third quarter of 2011, the most recent point for which full data exists, the total exposure of all private entities in the developed world to Greece now amounts to only 110 billion euro. And keep in mind that this data is already 4 months old. The deleveraging has, if anything, increased in pace. So while ejecting Greece from the Eurozone is still not exactly desirable in the short term, it would no longer automatically generate a catastrophe. And that has led the Europeans to change the way that they deal with the Greeks. First, European finance ministers this week rejected the result of negotiations between the Greek government and private investors. Little background here is necessary. In late 2011, the EU agreed to facilitate a 50% write-down in portions of the Greek debt portfolio, forcing the private sector to absorb the loss. In the time since then, however, the IMF has taken a more complete look at the Greek economy and surmised that a 50% write-down would be insufficient to meet the goal of getting Greece to a debt ratio of only 120% of GDP by 2020. Had a mismatch such as this occurred a year ago, Stratfor has no doubt that the Europeans would have simply papered over the problem with more bailout funds for fear that market confidence would collapse and the ensuing fear would take down the Eurozone. Now, however, the order was instead given to restart negotiations that impose an even stiffer haircut, not the position you would expect from people who fear the consequences of Greek failure. Second, none other than Chancellor Angela Merkel noted that despite all the efforts that have been made, neither the Greeks themselves nor the international community have yet managed to stabilize the situation. In order to maintain confidence, until now Merkel has spoken with relatively glowing words about how the Greeks were making progress on their budget issues. The change in tone indicates the beginning of the end of the charade that Greece is actually salvageable. Assuming Greece is disposed of with sufficient forethought, the event could actually bolster the European remediation process. Such an obvious punishment would be sure to prod states that have skimped on austerity, done end runs around the rules, or otherwise challenged the German-led model for Europe to change their behavior. Ireland would likely stop asking for a renegotiating of its bailout. Belgium and Spain would almost certainly get their budgets in line, and Italy would very likely start on some very serious pension reforms. It's obviously not a riskless track, but the smaller the world's exposure to Greece becomes, the more likely Greece is to find itself utterly alone.